The phone rang at 5:30 a.m. Emergency escort job. $800. VIP client needed protection. Ben Carter's calloused fingers traced his father's pocket watch, the metal worn smooth from years of worry. The caller knew his name, knew his garage, knew he was desperate for money. Tyler's school fees loomed like storm clouds. Ben arrived at Sinclair Hotel in his only decent suit, the same black fabric that had buried his wife 2 years ago. 20 floors up. Penthouse suite. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s, poised like a predator studying prey. Her eyes held secrets that made his chest tighten. She stepped forward, close enough that he caught her expensive perfume mixing with the scent of his own nervous sweat. "You're here to escort me, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice smooth as silk wrapped around steel. "But what you don't know is that I've been testing your strength in ways you can't imagine." Ben's throat went dry. Testing his strength? He'd fixed transmissions with his bare hands, worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, held his son while they both cried over Rachel's empty chair. But this woman spoke like she'd witnessed something he couldn't remember doing. Her fingers drummed against the marble countertop, manicured nails clicking a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. The penthouse stretched behind her like a museum of wealth he'd never touch. Crystal chandeliers caught morning light and scattered it across Persian rugs that probably cost more than his annual income. She moved with the confidence of someone who owned everything she surveyed, yet her eyes lingered on his work-worn hands with something that looked almost like respect. "I'm Nora," she said, extending a hand that felt surprisingly warm against his palm. "And tonight, I need you to escort me to the Millbrook Charity Gala." The name rolled off her tongue like she'd said it 1,000 times before. Ben nodded, his mind already calculating how $800 would cover Tyler's school uniform, maybe even the field trip deposit he'd been dreading. But questions buzzed in his skull like angry wasps. Why him? Why did her voice sound familiar when he was certain they'd never met? And why did she keep glancing at his pocket watch like it meant something to her, too? The gala venue sprawled across manicured lawns 30 minutes outside town, a sprawling estate that belonged in magazines Ben would never buy. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway like expensive jewelry displayed in a store window. Ben parked his dented pickup between a Mercedes and a BMW, feeling like a wolf among peacocks. Nora emerged from the passenger seat looking effortless in a simple black dress that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Yet she waited for him to offer his arm, and when their elbows touched, he felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with static. The way she moved beside him suggested practiced elegance, but her grip on his arm felt genuine, almost nervous. Inside the ballroom, wealth and privilege swirled around them like perfumed smoke. Men in $1,000 suits discussed stock options over champagne that sparkled like liquid diamonds. Women dripped in jewelry that could have bought Ben's garage 10 times over. But Nora navigated through the crowd with the ease of someone who belonged, stopping to exchange pleasantries with people who clearly knew her well. More than knew her. They deferred to her. A silver-haired man in a navy suit bowed slightly when she approached. A woman in emerald silk stepped aside to make room for her passage. Ben watched their faces, noting the careful respect, the subtle body language that screamed hierarchy. Who exactly was this woman who needed a mechanic from Millbrook to escort her through high society? The charity auction began with items that made Ben's head spin. A week in Paris, a vintage wine collection, a painting by someone whose name everyone seemed to recognize but him. Nora bid on several items with casual flicks of her wrist, numbers flying from her lips like loose change. 20,000. 50,000. When she pledged $100,000 to the Children's Education Fund, she signed the check without hesitation, her pen moving with the confidence of someone who wrote large numbers regularly. Ben caught a glimpse of the signature, elegant script that somehow looked familiar. His pocket watch seemed to grow heavier against his chest as puzzle pieces shifted in his mind, not quite forming a complete picture, but suggesting shapes he wasn't ready to acknowledge. During the drive home, Nora surprised him by asking about Tyler. Not polite inquiries about his age or school, but specific questions that suggested genuine interest. What did he want to be when he grew up? Did he miss having a mother figure? How did Ben manage single parenthood while working multiple jobs? Her questions pierced through his usual defenses like arrows finding their mark. Most people offered sympathy when they learned about Rachel, empty words that meant nothing. But Nora listened to his answers with an intensity that made him feel heard for the first time in years. When he mentioned Tyler's talent for math, her eyes lit up with something that looked like recognition. When he admitted his fear of not being enough for his son, she reached across the truck's bench seat and squeezed his shoulder with surprising gentleness. 3 days later, Nora appeared at his garage unannounced. She wore jeans and a cotton sweater that made her look younger, more approachable, yet somehow more dangerous to his peace of mind. Her Honda Civic needed an oil change, she claimed, though Ben noticed the maintenance sticker indicated recent service. He worked while she watched, asking technical questions that revealed more mechanical knowledge than most customers possessed. Her presence filled the cramped garage space like expensive perfume, making him hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. When Tyler arrived from school, she didn't just tolerate the 8-year-old's chatter about his day. She engaged him with mathematical puzzles that challenged his young mind while making him laugh with delight. That evening became the first of many. Nora started appearing at the garage regularly, always with some minor car issue that required Ben's attention. But she lingered after the work was done, helping Tyler with homework while Ben finished his evening appointments. She had a gift for explaining complex concepts in ways that made them seem simple, breaking down algebraic equations into building blocks that Tyler could stack into understanding. Ben found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified him. Rachel had been gone for 2 years, but the guilt of feeling attraction to another woman still cut through him like broken glass. The pocket watch seemed to burn against his chest whenever Nora smiled, a constant reminder of promises made and love lost. The first time Tyler hugged Nora goodbye, Ben's world shifted on its axis. His son had been cautious around adults since Rachel's death, building walls that even Ben struggled to penetrate. But something about Nora's genuine interest, her patient explanations, her way of treating Tyler like a person rather than a child, had earned his trust. As Ben watched them together, he saw something he'd forgotten could exist, a family dynamic that felt natural, unforced, right. The realization scared him more than any engine problem he'd ever faced. Letting someone into their carefully constructed world meant risking the devastation that came when that person left. And people always left, one way or another. But Nora kept coming back. When Tyler fell off his bike and scraped his knee raw, she appeared with bandages and ice cream before Ben had finished assessing the damage. When Mrs. Henderson's car broke down in the rain, Nora helped him push it to safety, while Tyler held an umbrella over their heads. When the garage's ancient heating system finally gave up during an early cold snap, she showed up with space heaters and hot coffee without being asked. These weren't grand gestures designed to impress. They were quiet acts of support that spoke to something deeper than obligation or pity. They felt like the actions of someone who cared, genuinely, and without expectation of return. The shift happened gradually, like sunrise bleeding across a dark sky. Ben found himself sharing stories about Rachel without the sharp edge of grief that usually accompanied her memory. Nora listened without offering empty platitudes or advice, simply holding space for his pain while refusing to be intimidated by it. She talked about her own losses too, though she remained vague about details. A father who worked too much, a mother who left too early. The weight of expectations that threatened to crush anyone who tried to carry them alone. Their conversations revealed matching scars, different in origin but similar in depth. Two people who understood that life could break you in ways that left you stronger and more fragile simultaneously. Tyler's 9th birthday approached like a storm cloud on Ben's horizon. Previous celebrations had been modest affairs, limited by budget constraints and his own emotional capacity for joy. But this year felt different. Tyler had been dropping hints about a baseball glove for weeks, his eyes lighting up whenever they passed the sporting goods store window. Ben had been saving every spare dollar, but the numbers still fell short of the price tag attached to quality equipment. The gap between what he could provide and what his son deserved felt like a canyon he couldn't bridge. Pride warred with desperation as he considered asking Nora for help, knowing she had the means, but terrified of what that request might cost him in terms of dignity and independence. Nora solved his dilemma before he could voice it. She arrived at the garage 3 days before Tyler's birthday with a proposal that caught Ben off guard. Her company was sponsoring a youth baseball league and needed someone to teach basic automotive skills to teenagers. The pay would be more than generous, enough to cover the glove and the birthday party Tyler had been dreaming about. Ben accepted the offer with gratitude that felt too large for words, though something nagged at the edges of his consciousness. The timing seemed too convenient, the solution too perfect. But Tyler's excitement over his upcoming birthday overshadowed Ben's concerns about Nora's motives. The birthday party became a celebration that exceeded every expectation. Nora helped organize games that kept a dozen 8-year-olds entertained for hours. She produced a cake that looked professionally made, decorated with Tyler's favorite cartoon characters in perfect detail. When Tyler opened his gift and found the baseball glove he'd been coveting, his shriek of joy echoed through the garage like music. But it was the second gift that stopped Ben's heart. A framed photograph of him and Tyler working on a car together, captured from an angle that suggested the photographer had been watching them for some time. The image showed them in their natural element, focused and content, a father teaching his son the skills that would serve him throughout life. Ben's hands trembled as he held the frame, recognizing the love and attention to detail that had gone into creating this moment of permanence. That night, after Tyler had fallen asleep clutching his new glove, Ben confronted Nora about the photograph. How long had she been watching them? Why was she documenting their lives without permission? Her explanation came wrapped in words that felt carefully chosen, rehearsed. She'd been moved by their relationship, she said. The way Ben poured everything into being the father Tyler needed had inspired her to capture that dedication. Photography was a hobby of hers, a way of preserving moments that might otherwise be lost to time. But her eyes avoided his while she spoke, and Ben noticed the way her fingers drummed against her thigh when she was nervous. The explanations felt true but incomplete, like puzzle pieces that fit but left gaping holes in the bigger picture. Over the following weeks, Ben's awareness of Nora's presence in their lives sharpened to an uncomfortable degree. She seemed to know his schedule before he did, appearing at moments when he most needed help but hadn't asked for it. Her car developed problems with suspicious frequency, each issue requiring just enough time to fix that she could spend hours in the garage. When he mentioned financial concerns about Tyler's education, she casually dropped information about scholarship opportunities that seemed tailor-made for his son's situation. The generosity should have felt like blessing, but instead it stirred a growing unease that Ben couldn't quite articulate. Nobody was this helpful without wanting something in return. The question was what Nora wanted from him that she couldn't simply ask for directly. The answer began revealing itself on a Tuesday morning when Tyler burst into the garage with news that changed everything. His teacher had told the class about anonymous donations that had covered field trip costs for several students. Tyler had been selected for a special enrichment program that would challenge his mathematical abilities while providing college preparation support. "Best of all," he said with the enthusiasm of a child who believed in miracles, someone had paid for his participation in the summer baseball camp he'd been dreaming about attending. Ben's stomach dropped as the implications hit him like a physical blow. The timing was too perfect, the beneficiaries too specific. Only one person had the means and the knowledge to orchestrate such targeted generosity. Confronting Nora required more courage than Ben had needed for any conversation since Rachel's diagnosis. He waited until Tyler was at school, then asked her to meet him at the garage under the pretense of needing help with paperwork. She arrived wearing the casual clothes that had become her uniform during their time together, but her posture seemed more rigid than usual, as if she sensed the coming storm. Ben didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid out the evidence methodically. The perfectly timed scholarship opportunities, the anonymous donations that benefited exactly the right children, the job offer that had appeared precisely when he needed it most. Each point landed like a hammer blow, and he watched Nora's carefully maintained composure crack with each accusation. Her confession came in fragments, like a dam breaking under pressure too great to contain. Yes, she had been behind the donations. Yes, she had orchestrated the opportunities that had blessed Tyler's education. But her motivations weren't what Ben assumed. She wasn't playing some elaborate game with their lives for her own entertainment. She had been trying to level a playing field that had been tilted against them from birth. Ben's anger wavered as she spoke, confusion replacing rage as her words painted a picture that didn't match his assumptions. If she had the power to change their circumstances so dramatically, what did that make her? And why would someone with that kind of influence care about a mechanic and his son in a small Vermont town? The truth emerged like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Nora Sinclair. The name that had been printed on buildings around town, displayed on charitable foundation letterheads, whispered in conversations about the region's most successful business leaders. She was the CEO of Sinclair Industries, heir to a fortune built on manufacturing and innovation, one of the youngest executives to ever control a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The woman who had been changing his oil and helping with Tyler's homework was the same person whose decisions affected thousands of employees and shaped economic policy across 3 states. Ben felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole, his understanding of reality reshaping itself around impossible truths, but the revelation of her identity only raised deeper questions. Why would someone of Nora's stature spend time in his garage? What could she possibly gain from watching him work on broken cars and struggle with single parenthood? Her explanation, when it finally came, revealed depths of loneliness and purpose that Ben hadn't expected. She had grown up in wealth, but not warmth, surrounded by people who wanted things from her rather than connection with her. Her father had built an empire but forgotten how to build relationships. Her mother had died when Nora was Tyler's age, leaving her to navigate privilege and responsibility without the guidance she needed most. Watching Ben raise Tyler with patience and genuine love had shown her something she'd never experienced firsthand. What it looked like when someone chose to put another person's needs before their own, not from obligation, but from love. The weight of her confession settled over them like snow, muffling sound and changing the landscape of everything they'd shared. Ben understood now why she'd hidden her identity, why she'd approached their relationship with such careful steps. Wealth created barriers that were difficult to cross, assumptions that poisoned interactions before they could develop into anything real. But the deception still stung, even when he understood its necessity. Every moment they'd shared had been filtered through her secret knowledge of who she really was. While he'd been falling for a woman he thought he understood, she'd been watching him with the advantage of complete information. The imbalance felt like betrayal, even when logic insisted it was protection. Tyler's reaction to learning about Nora's true identity surprised them both. At 9 years old, he possessed a clarity about relationships that adults often lost. He didn't care about her money or her corporate title. What mattered to him was that she had helped him with homework, celebrated his birthday, and treated him like someone worth knowing. The revelation that she was rich and important didn't change the fact that she knew his favorite pizza toppings and remembered which mathematical concepts challenged him most. Children, Ben realized, had an advantage when it came to measuring the worth of the people in their lives. They judged by actions rather than assets, by presence rather than position. In Tyler's world, Nora remained the same person she'd always been, just with more interesting stories to tell about boardrooms and business trips. But adult relationships required navigation of complexities that children didn't face. The revelation of Nora's wealth had shifted the balance between them in ways that couldn't be ignored. Every gesture she made now carried the weight of her resources. Every problem she helped solve raised questions about whether she was offering assistance or charity. Ben found himself second-guessing interactions that had felt natural before, wondering if her interest in his life was genuine or if he represented some kind of social experiment for a board executive. The uncertainty poisoned moments that should have brought joy, turning her presence from comfort into confusion. The crisis that would test their relationship arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Tyler's school field trip to the nature preserve should have been a simple overnight camping adventure, the kind of experience that built character and created lasting memories. Ben had signed the permission slips with pride, knowing that his son was ready for this taste of independence. But when the phone call came at 2 a.m, his world collapsed into the narrow focus of pure terror. Tyler was missing. The boy had been accounted for during the evening head count, but was gone when counselors checked the tents at midnight. Search teams had been combing the woods for hours without finding any trace of him. Ben reached the preserve in record time, his truck's engine screaming in protest as he pushed it beyond safe limits. The scene that greeted him looked like a war zone of organized panic. State police coordinated with park rangers and volunteer searchers, their flashlight beams sweeping through darkness that seemed to swallow light without giving anything back. Parents clustered near the command tent, their faces reflecting his own terror, their presence a reminder that every missing child represented someone's entire world hanging in the balance. Ben joined the search immediately, his knowledge of Tyler's habits and fears guiding him toward areas others might overlook. But hours passed without progress, and dawn brought no relief from the nightmare that had consumed his existence. Nora appeared without fanfare or explanation, emerging from the chaos like a guardian angel dressed in hiking boots and practical clothing. She brought resources that transformed the search effort from desperate improvisation into professional operation. Helicopter surveillance, trained search dogs, technical equipment that could detect heat signatures through dense forest canopy. When Ben started to ask how she'd mobilized such extensive support so quickly, she silenced him with a look that brooked no argument. There would be time for questions later. Right now, finding Tyler was the only thing that mattered. Her presence steadied him in ways he couldn't articulate, providing an anchor of competence and determination when his own resolve threatened to crumble under the weight of paternal terror. The 48 hours that followed tested every assumption Ben had made about his capacity for hope and endurance. Sleep became impossible, food turned to ash in his mouth, and coherent thought fled in the face of scenarios too horrible to contemplate. But Nora remained constant throughout the ordeal, coordinating search efforts while somehow managing to be present whenever Ben's composure threatened to crack completely. She didn't offer empty reassurances or platitudes about everything working out for the best. Instead, she provided practical support and unwavering determination, her presence communicating more clearly than words that Tyler would be found, because failure was not an acceptable outcome. When the call finally came that Tyler had been located, alive and largely unharmed but suffering from dehydration and exhaustion, Ben's legs gave out beneath him. Relief hit him like a physical force, draining strength from muscles that had been sustained by adrenaline and desperation for too long. Tyler had fallen into a ravine while exploring off the marked trail, injuring his ankle badly enough that walking became impossible. He'd survived by following survival techniques Ben had taught him, rationing the water in his bottle and staying put rather than wandering further into unknown territory. The rescue team found him conscious and alert, scared but unbroken, calling for his father with a voice that carried clearly through the forest air. Holding Tyler in his arms again felt like resurrection, like being granted a second chance at everything that mattered. But the crisis had stripped away pretenses and revealed truths that couldn't be ignored. In those dark hours when Tyler's fate hung in uncertainty, Nora had shown Ben who she really was beneath the wealth and corporate power. She was someone who would mobilize every resource at her disposal to protect the people she cared about. Someone who understood that love required action, not just words or good intentions. Someone who could have walked away from their complicated situation, but chose instead to stand beside him during the worst experience of his life. The conversation they needed to have couldn't be delayed any longer. With Tyler safely recovered and sleeping peacefully in his own bed, Ben and Nora finally addressed the questions that had been building between them, like pressure behind a dam. Her wealth and position weren't obstacles to be overcome or advantages to be exploited. They were simply facts about her life that existed alongside her capacity for loyalty, generosity, and love. She had hidden her identity not to deceive him, but to create space for a relationship that could develop without the complications that accompanied her public persona. Her interest in him and Tyler wasn't charity or social experimentation. It was recognition of something real and valuable that she had never experienced in her carefully controlled world of business and obligation. Ben's own revelations came harder, requiring him to acknowledge truths he'd been avoiding since Rachel's death. He had been afraid to love again, not because he couldn't move past his grief, but because he couldn't bear the thought of Tyler losing another important person in his young life. But Tyler had already made his choice about Nora, accepting her into their family with the wisdom that came from recognizing authentic care. The boy's happiness and security mattered more than Ben's fears about emotional vulnerability or social inequality. If Nora was willing to accept the complications that came with loving a widowed mechanic and his son, then Ben owed it to all of them to try building something real from the foundation they'd already created. 8 months later, life had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and completely transformed. Ben still worked in his garage, but now it was a business he owned rather than a job he endured. Nora's investment had been structured as a legitimate business partnership rather than charity, giving him dignity along with financial security. She split her time between her corporate responsibilities and their life in Millbrook, proving that love could bridge gaps that seemed impossible to cross. Tyler thrived in programs that challenged his intellect, while keeping him grounded in the community that had shaped his early years. The three of them had become a family not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the accumulation of small moments that added up to something larger than any of them could have created alone. The garage had become more than just a place where Ben fixed cars. It served as an informal community center where neighbors gathered to share news and seek advice. Nora's presence had brought new opportunities to the area, but she was careful to support existing businesses rather than overshadowing them. Her foundation provided scholarships and training programs that created pathways for young people who might otherwise have limited options. But the most significant change was harder to quantify, visible only to those who paid attention to details like the way Ben smiled more easily or how Tyler's confidence had blossomed under the attention of two adults who believed in his potential. On a Tuesday evening in October, as autumn painted the Vermont hills in shades of gold and crimson, Ben found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Tyler was finishing homework at the kitchen table while Nora reviewed reports from her office in the converted space above the garage. The domestic scene felt both miraculous and completely natural, as if this was the life they had always been meant to live. His father's pocket watch sat on the windowsill, no longer a burden to be carried, but a reminder that time could heal wounds while creating new possibilities for joy. The sound of Tyler's laughter drew his attention back to the present moment. Nora had abandoned her paperwork to help with a particularly challenging math problem, her explanations accompanied by diagrams that turned abstract concepts into concrete understanding. Ben watched them together, his heart full of gratitude for the courage it had taken to let someone new into their carefully guarded world. The risk had been enormous, but the rewards were beyond anything he could have imagined when he'd answered that early morning phone call months ago. That phone call seemed like a lifetime ago now, though Ben could still remember the desperation he'd felt when the opportunity for $800 had presented itself. Money had been the hook that drew him into Nora's orbit, but it wasn't what kept him there. What bound them together was something more valuable and more durable than financial security. They had built trust despite deception, found love despite impossible circumstances, and created a family despite all the reasons why it shouldn't have worked. The future stretched ahead of them like an unmapped road, full of challenges and opportunities they would face together. As evening shadows lengthened across the garage floor, Ben made a decision that felt both monumental and completely obvious. He reached for his father's pocket watch, its familiar weight settling into his palm one final time. Walking to where Nora and Tyler sat bent over homework, he placed the watch on the table between them. "This belonged to my father," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of family history and future promise. "And someday, when you're ready, it will belong to you, Tyler. But right now, I think it belongs to all of us." Nora's fingers traced the worn metal surface, understanding the significance of the gesture without need for explanation. Tyler looked up from his math homework, his young face serious as he absorbed the importance of the moment. The watch would remain on the table, a symbol of time shared and love chosen, marking not an ending but a beginning. None of them could have predicted when their story first began.